Good morning. It's Friday, February 14th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 497 days old. Happy Valentine's Day to all you lovebirds out there. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. Well, tomorrow's hostage release is reportedly back on, according to the latest reports. Sasha Truvanov, Sagi Dekelchen, and Yair Horn will come home from Hamas captivity. It was dicey there for a few days. It took Donald Trump threatening the Palestinian terrorist group and perhaps by extension its proxies to get this thing back on track. I still think all of the hostages should be released right now, without delay, all of them. But I am grateful for one thing. The enablers of Hamas, Qatar, Turkey, Iran, and others are feeling the heat. That's the result of political pressure that we just didn't see enough of for far too long. That's changing, and that is a good thing. Today's guest is retired IDF Major General Tal Kelman. Not only does he have a distinguished career in the IDF under his belt, including overseeing Israel's Iran file, he also spent over 3 decades in the Israeli Air Force, holding a variety of high-ranking roles. Now he works as a strategic and defense consultant for research institutes and think tanks. Yesterday, my colleague Bradley Bowman, another military man and a former Black Hawk pilot, caught up with him to assess the latest developments out of Israel and that tough surrounding neighborhood. We'll play that interview for you shortly. The release of at least 3 more Israeli hostages tomorrow has effectively guaranteed calm for another week. But let's be clear, the absence of violence does not mean that things are stable. A rocket was fired out of Gaza yesterday. Never mind that it landed back in Gaza, the intent was to strike Israel. Beaten and battered, Hamas is nonetheless bruising for another fight. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said as much yesterday. Israel's Air Force has been hammering Hezbollah targets in Lebanon. This includes weapons, launchers, and more. Hezbollah is readying for another round with the Jewish state. Earlier this week, the Houthis vowed to attack Israel if the Gaza ceasefire collapses. The Yemeni terror group has ballistic missiles, and they are itching to launch more of them at Israel. And then there's Israel. The Israelis seem to be of two minds. On the one hand, the people undeniably appreciate quiet after 16 months of war, and they are celebrating the return of every hostage released from Hamas captivity. But Israelis also understand that the threats surrounding them, if they continue to fester, there will be other 10-7s, and that's something that nobody wants. So which way will things shake out? Nobody knows. I recently read yet another book about Israel's War of Independence. The fighting halted twice during that consequential war before the fighting resumed, and Israel eventually won the day. The lesson? Quiet doesn't always beget quiet, and sometimes wars paradoxically achieve peace. Whether any of that applies here, well, that remains to be seen. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, according to U.S. intelligence, Israel is considering a preemptive strike on Iran's nuclear program. Shocker, right? I mean, what would we do without intelligence? Okay, in all seriousness, on Wednesday evening, the Washington Post and Wall Street Journal both reported that the Biden administration received an intelligence assessment last month concluding that Israel might strike Iran's nuclear program during the first half of 2025. The Post said that the Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA, and the Intelligence Directorate of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon produced the intel report, which pinpointed Iran's Fordo and Natanz nuclear facilities as Israel's likely targets. Again, no surprise here, but here's my question. Who's leaking this stuff? According to the Wall Street Journal, the intelligence report described 2 lines of Israeli thinking. First, that Trump is more likely than Biden to back an Israeli strike. And second, that the window for rolling back Iran's nuclear program is closing. I call that the window of weakness. The Trump administration reportedly received its own intel briefing, which also indicated that an Israeli strike on Iran's nuclear program may be imminent. Iran doesn't appear too worried, at least not outwardly. Yesterday, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian boasted that even if 100 nuclear facilities are hit, Iran will bounce back and build 1,000 more. If you ask me, that guy is just asking for a beating. Headline 2, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has been smuggling cash to Hezbollah on civilian air flights. On X, the IDF's Arabic language spokesperson explained that the IDF has been working with the U.S. to thwart bulk cash smuggling to Hezbollah by way of civilian airlines. This isn't a total surprise. It's been happening for years. And then last month, the Wall Street Journal cited an Israeli defense official who said that Iran was sending suitcases full of cash to Hezbollah on flights destined for Beirut's Rafik Hariri International Airport. Yesterday, Lebanese aviation authorities reportedly prevented an Iranian passenger flight from landing at Rafik Hariri. The flight remained grounded in Tehran, leaving dozens of Lebanese citizens stranded. I don't feel bad. Footage circulated on social media showing Hezbollah supporters blocking the road next to the airport in Beirut in protest of aviation authorities' decision. The Lebanese army was reportedly called in to disperse the crowd. Incidentally, the grounded aircraft was an Iranian Mahan airplane. Mahan Air was sanctioned here in the United States for serving the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. FDD research contributed to that government action back in 2020. And headline 3, United Arab Emirates Ambassador to the United States, Yousef al-Otaiba, implicitly endorsed President Trump's plans for Gaza. Speaking at the World Government Summit in Dubai, Otaiba said there's, quote, no alternative, end quote, to Trump's vision for the Middle East, and that Abu Dhabi wants to find common ground with the Trump administration. At the end of the day, Otaiba said that the Emiratis are in the solution-seeking business. That's a quote. So watch this space, folks. The UAE is often willing to take risks that other countries in the Middle East will not. Egypt, however, is singing a different tune. Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is reportedly refusing to travel to Washington to meet with President Trump, so long as the commander-in-chief continues to call for Palestinians to relocate from Gaza to Egypt and Jordan. Egypt is said to be working on a counterproposal, which Cairo is expected to present later this month. The details are still hazy. Reports suggest that this plan involves the reconstruction of Gaza over 3 to 5 years in partnership with the Arab governments, the European Union, the United Nations. Nope, no mention of the United States or Israel getting involved, and definitely no mention of the the removal of Gazans from the Gaza Strip. Okay, now it's time to press play on that conversation between retired IDF Major General Tal Kelman and my colleague Brad Bowman, two military guys chatting about the threats of the Middle East. I can't think of a more romantic way for you to kick off your Valentine's Day. Let's see what they have to say.
Tal, welcome to the FDD Morning Brief.
Hi, Brad. Great to see you. Thank you for having me.
Great to see you. I enjoyed our conversation a while back, and I'm really excited to talk with you. Really respect your experience and insights and eager to hear your thoughts. So if with your permission, let's just jump right in. You were the head of the IDF Strategic Division, as John just said. And I'm curious, how has, in your view, the strategic situation in the Middle East changed since October 7th? And what challenges and opportunities do you think that presents for both Israel and the United States?
Well, Brad, I think the strategic situation has developed dramatically in the past 16 months. I think in the broad picture, when you look at the Middle East, coming into the war, we saw two main forces, I would say, in the Middle East. One is Iran and the Iran axis, which is the way Israel saw it: Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Gaza Strip, West Bank, and Iran building more and more proxies and military capabilities and proliferating them around the Middle East. And on the other hand, the moderate axis, which is Israel, the moderate Arab countries, some we have peace agreements with, Abraham Accords, and some we don't. And I think what we've seen during the past 16 months, a war started in Gaza, but after 24 hours, it became a regional war, although it wasn't full scale. And after 16 months, the Iranian axis has been dramatically weakened. And I think there's an opportunity, an historic opportunity, to reshape the Middle East. On the one hand, to contain, weaken, and deter Iran. And on the other hand, strengthen the moderate axis and maybe widen the circle of peace agreements, Abraham Accords, first and most important, Saudi Arabia, but not only. I think there are other potentials that could be here. But there's one other thing that I would like to point out. I think we need to be with our eyes on the ball. There is a potential here for a third axis developing in the Middle East. which I would say a so-called Muslim Brotherhood axis, Turkey, the new Syria, maybe Qatar, and that is a force that could be, due to the dramatic developments in Syria and the Turkish influence in Syria, could become another axis, and the tension between those three axes is something that we need to deal with. But in the whole, I think it's a dynamic reality. There are many, many opportunities, I think. And I think the biggest challenge is how do we reshape the Middle East to create peace and stability. But we, at this point, I feel that 80% or 90% is focused on what's happening in Gaza. And obviously, we've got kidnapped in Gaza. We need to solve the problem in Gaza, but we need to be very quick because the window of opportunity in reshaping the Middle East won't last forever.
I think that's such a great point. I want to touch in more detail in a moment on Tehran and its terror proxies and what's going on there, and also Syria. But before I do that, I'd love to ask you about Lebanon. What is the current situation in Lebanon from your perspective? And you spoke about opportunities and challenges. And what opportunities and challenges do you see specific to Lebanon?
I think, Brad, Lebanon is one of the areas where I think is one of the biggest opportunities, because I think, Hezbollah, which is Iran's strongest proxy, has been weakened dramatically, military capabilities, politically. And I think Israel was very correct in fighting Hezbollah, not fighting the Lebanese state or the Lebanese people. I think if you look at the end of the day, Hezbollah's narrative as being the defender of Lebanon failed. And there are dramatic political developments it's not pre-war, but during the continuation of the war, but when there's this ceasefire agreement with a new, I think, very positive president in Lebanon, a prime minister, a government that is being built. And I think there's a historic opportunity to change the balance of power in Lebanon. That would be like taking the continuation of the military activity into a political new era. And I think here the Israel and the United States, and mainly it should be United States, should lead a policy that strengthens the new president and the new government, brings Lebanon an economic bundle that is conditioned on some sort of demilitarization, backs Israel freedom of action to act against violation of Hezbollah of the 1701, close and secure Lebanese borders, and conduct an economical warfare against Hezbollah. I think those 5 points can create a new era in Lebanon. And I would say 5+1, because I must say that I think that I would put on the table an idea of a roadmap towards normalization between Lebanon and Israel. And I think it's possible because there's no dispute between the Lebanese people and Israel. The dispute has been between Hezbollah and Israel. And once Hezbollah is weakened, I think that's a potential that we need to thrive towards.
Such great points. The sidelining, weakening of Hezbollah is obviously so good for the people of Lebanon, as you implied there, but it also seems to me deprives Tehran of what has been its most significant strategic deterrent against Israel vis-a-vis its nuclear program, which we'll talk about in a minute. Speaking of change, boy, we've seen Syria upended, right? Some seem to think it's all good news there. I'm curious, is it? How do you think about the current situation in Syria?
Well, again, I think a surprise for many, if not most, in the Middle East. I think the fall of the Assad regime is dramatic. I do think that Israel was very quick and decisive in acting against the Syrian military capability in order to prevent, I would say, advanced military capabilities get to the hands of extreme Islamists. But at the end of the day, the Julani is now talking as the leader of Syria. He sees himself as the leader of a one Syria. And at this point, he's saying, I would say, the right things towards the West. But we mustn't forget his record and his beliefs. So here I think there is an opportunity. I think Israel's interest is that Syria remains a one Syria, keep the Shia axis in Iran out of Syria, but at the same time try to drive this regime to being positive. And because this regime has a huge burden of the reconstruction of Syria, which we're talking about of hundreds of billions of dollars, and that's not something that Turkey can do. It's not something that Russia can do. It's something that can come from the West. It can come from the Gulf. And I think we can try and lift sanctions and gradually influence this regime and try and make it as positive as possible. But at the same time, we need to try and restrain as much as we can the Turkish influence in Syria. Prevent military Turkish capabilities coming into Syria. And so here I think there is a potential for positive developments, but we need to go here in a step-by-step, I would say, strategy.
Very good. Perhaps arguably the most significant change since October 7th, I would say, is that, we've seen a decades-long strategy from the Islamic Republic of Iran where they're very happy to attack Israel and the United States using proxies and very happy for the counterpunches to be absorbed by Arabs rather than Iranians. And yet you guys hit back directly at the Islamic Republic of Iran in Iran twice, with the second one obviously being far more impactful and significant, I would say. Talk to me a little bit more, if you would, about how things are changed between the direct interactions, to use a polite DC word, between Israel and Iran and what that means going forward.
Yeah, well, I think the war actually enhanced the pace of the direct friction between Israel and Iran. But at the end of the day, if you look at the Iranian basic concept in Iran's regional concept in the Middle East was based on three pillars. One is the proxies, building the proxies, proliferating arms to the proxies, creating influence in countries that have weak sovereignty. That's the first pillar. The second pillar is their conventional military capability, which is advanced and sophisticated and comes in big numbers. And the third is the nuclear program. So if I look at those three pillars, I must say, after 16 months and after the direct friction, on the one hand, I think the proxy concept did not deliver what Iran would have expected it to deliver in the Middle East. It did challenge Israel, but I think Israel demonstrated very strong military capability vis-a-vis those proxies. I'm talking about Hamas, I'm talking about Hezbollah, I'm talking about the Syrian army capability. I'm talking about, obviously, the direct hit of Iran. So that's one thing. On the other hand, when you look at the conventional military capabilities, I think Iran demonstrated the capability, the boldness to use them. Israel had excellent results on defense, but defense is never foolproof. So I think at the end of the day, Iran sees this as a move, or can see this as a military action that could be enhanced in the future. And the third thing is the nuclear program. So at this point, they're still, I would say, they're not dashing to nuclear capability. They're still crawling in the area of the threshold of nuclear capability. But I do see that the discussion on Iran's nuclear doctrine is growing in Iran, and they're at coming up to some sort of junction. And that obviously challenges Israel and United States strategy.
No, thank you. I think we need a full hour. There's so much I'd love to ask you about, but just eyeing the clock here, one last question for you, if I may. It's leaving aside military, technical, sensitive issues, which I wouldn't want to get into. I'm very interested in what you believe Israel needs from the United States generally in terms of policy or approach or disposition toward Iran and its nuclear program, and a quick assessment on a U.S.-Israeli military cooperation, some of which we saw a lot of that in April and October, and a lot of people don't know the details. And the more I dig, the more I'm impressed by how our two countries work together. But short question, what does Israel need from the U.S. vis-a-vis Iran, its nuclear program generally, and how do you assess U.S.-Israel military cooperation?
Well, as of the first question, the first thing that we need to, I would say, change the deficit of deterrence that there was in the Middle East pre-war. Now, I think that has changed during the war, But the main, I think the pivotal point of creating deterrence is credible military threat that is on the table. I think Israel demonstrated its boldness and its capabilities. And I think they surprised Iran. But at the end of the day, it needs to be not only Israeli credible military threat, it needs to be also an American credible military threat. That needs to be part of the strategy. Even if you want to go to diplomacy, and I'm not against diplomacy, you need to have a credible military threat as part of diplomacy. That's one thing. The second thing is that what Israel would need is the strategic backing of the United States, so that if there is a military action, immediately a minute after that military action, preferably would be American-Israeli combined, but if not, America immediately stands, backs, and puts the threat on the table to try and avoid it to develop to a regional war and affect the decision-making in Iran. The second thing, as to the US-Israeli cooperation, well, I mean, in my previous job, that was one of my portfolios, was moving Israel from the European Command to Central Command. I think we're after 3 or 4 years where the Israeli-American military cooperation has enhanced dramatically. Very intimate, very close. And at the end of the day, there are two militaries that have the same mission to maintain peace and stability in the Middle East, to deter Iran and to fight Iran if needed. So I think that's been done very well. I think that the combined exercises that have been happening in the past few years, the Juniper Oak, it wasn't exercises, the combined actions that happened during war, that's not exercise, that's real fighting together. And I think the next step should be we combine cooperation not only on defense, but we can cooperate also in offensive areas. It doesn't mean that we're going to use the offensive capabilities, but we as militaries need to have those capabilities. That's part of building deterrence and part of building a credible military threat.
Well, Tal, just really incredible insights. I appreciate what you said about deterrence. We know that deterrence is based on perception of both military capability and political will. So if Iran believes that America will never throw a punch, then we're more likely to have problems. So I completely agree with you on that. And I'm so glad you mentioned Juniper Oak. 2023 was the largest U.S.-Israel bilateral military exercise ever. I think we need to do a Juniper Oak 2025 that replicates as closely as possible and rehearses a combined U.S.-Israeli strike on Iran's nuclear program. And I would say we need to have B-2s included in that. So that's my view. But anyway, I want to thank you for joining us. Thank you for sharing your insights. And I look forward to being in touch again soon with you. Thank you.
Well, Brad, thank you very much for having me. And I really hope that our two countries will take advantage of the historical opportunities that there are in the Middle East in the next few months, few years. Thanks for having me.
Well said. Thank you. Thanks again.
All right, great interview, and special thanks to Brad Bowman, my colleague here at FDD, for handling that with Tal Kelman. Really sharp guys, just getting in the weeds. All right, here's what FDD has on tap for you today. FDD founder and president Cliff May's column in the Washington Times discusses Trump's controversial Gaza-Lago plan, which has sparked an uproar across the Arab world, Western European capitals, and on college campuses across America. It's plausible that the plan was, in part, an attempt to challenge Egyptian President Sisi and Jordanian King Abdullah to become more involved in plans for the day after. The question remains, will Jordan and Egypt step up to the plate or continue to fetch without providing solutions? My colleague Nathan Pekarsik has a piece in Town Hall on the multifaceted threat China poses to Taiwan, not only through military aggression, but also through control of supply chains, particularly in semiconductor production. Nate highlights a failure of the U.S. to grasp the full scope of this danger, and he argues that Washington must adopt a radically different approach to competing with the CCP, including diversifying the U.S. semiconductor supply chain to loosen Beijing's stranglehold. Finally, be sure to check out my colleague Ivana Stradner's latest piece in The Telegraph after U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump said that ensuring Ukraine's future shouldn't follow the path paved by the Minsk agreements. Signed over a decade ago, these accords faltered because they failed to provide meaningful support for Kiev and allowed Moscow to strengthen its presence in the Donbass under the guise of a ceasefire. So while the Trump administration is right to draw lessons from the past, Ivana argues that Ukrainian NATO membership should remain on the table and the U.S. must hold the line against Putin. And that's it for this special Valentine's Day edition of the FDD Morning Brief. I hope you felt the love, maybe even thought I sounded a little bit like Barry White. Anyway, please show us some love here at FDD. Check out the expert analysis on our website, fdd.org. Read our quick takes on X at FDD, or watch the videos we post on Instagram and YouTube. And do make that tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. Tune in Monday for another episode of the FDD Morning Brief. We're going on a trip to the Arabian Gulf. I'll be speaking with Aziz Al-Ghashian, a Saudi scholar who will weigh in on Saudi Arabia, the prospects of normalization with Israel, and the tumult we're watching across the broader Middle East. Until then, have a great weekend. I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.